2014 has been declared the Year of Russian Culture in Great Britain and the Year of British Culture in Russia. The narrator of the film which you are about to watch is the great Russian actor Vasily Livanov, who played the role of Sherlock Holmes in the famous Soviet TV series. In 2006, Queen Elizabeth II awarded Vasily Livanov the Order of the British Empire in recognition of his outstanding performance in the role. Margaret Thatcher is also known to have considered Livanov the best Holmes ever, along with discerning fans around the world from America all the way to Japan. And although at present the tone of dialogue between our nations is increasingly dictated more by politics than by culture, we would like to restore the balance and to interpret even problematic topics through the prism of culture. And so, the letter M, one of the strangest and most complicated cases clouding the relationship between Russia and the West, seen through the eyes of Sherlock Holmes. The person about whom we will tell you will doubtless remind you of a famous literary character whose crimes were investigated by none other than Sherlock Holmes. And never mind that we're now at the beginning of the 21st century, the words of Dr. Watson are now even more relevant. Holmes, I remember the good old days, and those killers and murderers and assassins whom you used to catch in the last century seem to me now innocent youths and naive sheep, compared to the wolves whom we have recently met. The public knows relatively little about William Browder. One of the most brilliant financial minds in Europe, he teamed up with the Lebanese financier Edmond Safra, founder of New York's Republic National Bank, and created the investment fund known as the Hermitage Fund. 3 years later, Safra, one of the richest men on the planet, died in a mysterious death in the smoke fumes of a fire set by his own bodyguard in the safest country in the world, the Principality of Monaco. This death in the Belle Époque apartments became the first, but certainly not the last that would occur in Browder's entourage. Aye, there's the genius and the wonder of the thing. The man pervades London, and no one has heard of him. He sits motionless like a spider in the center of its web, but that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows very well each quiver of them. As a result of a complicated scheme involving Browder on one hand and corrupt bureaucrats on the other, his Russian tax lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, got caught in the web. Put in prison in a case involving large-scale tax evasion, he died in jail. And although the conditions in jails in Russia, as in most places in the world, are far from Ted Mayer's, who was imprisoned in Monaco in connection with the death of Edmond Safra, The death of Magnitsky in jail is no less mysterious and tragic than the death of Safra in Monaco or the apparent suicide of Berezovsky in London. Browder pulled the thread, and now the Magnitsky Act has been passed by the US Congress and signed by President Obama and has become law. Of course, the death of Sergei Magnitsky is a tragedy. But how many unknown tragedies happen in America's jails each year?
The most thoroughly implemented social experiment in American history has been the experiment of mass incarceration. And today the United States boasts about the fact that 1 out of every 72 adults is in prison or jail. And when you consider that in other historical times, for example, Stalin's Russia, East Germany, and other regimes that have been deemed to be repressive, at no point did they ever reach these numbers in terms of raw numbers or percentages of their population that were under some form of direct government control, either caged in prisons or under some direct form of government supervision or surveillance. Each year, over 5,000 prisoners die in American prisons, most of them as a result of inadequate medical care.
So thousands of cases like Magnitsky's every year, but none of them useful for Browder. Shocking is how even auditors describe the state of medical care in many U.S. state prisons. One of such crying examples is the prison at Ely, Nevada.
What's happened in Ely, Nevada has been basically a chronic understaffing of the prison hospital and medical system there, as well as the denial of medical care. At least one prisoner on death row literally rotted to death from gangrene from his untreated medical needs. And many prisoners have died there as a result of inadequate medical care. But unfortunately, this is far from an isolated example. Throughout the United States and in prison legal news, we report every month case after case after case of prisoners dying or being left crippled or disfigured or maimed as a result of inadequate medical care. And this is very much the norm, unfortunately, across the prison system.
Having studied the evidence of frightful conditions in which prisoners are kept in the jails in the USA, we can't help asking, why has the US Congress not paid attention to these things, but as to a tragedy overseas, it does pay attention? And why, with the prompting of William Browder? What is the Magnitsky Act? We will answer with the words of the famous American historian Stephen Cohen. America, putting on judicial robes, has decided to judge what is good and bad within Russia's internal borders. There are no legal foundations for this, only ideological ones. Just a year after Browder had been lobbying for the so-called Magnitsky Act, the oligarch Boris Berezovsky, one of Safra's last partners and someone who had met with him not long before his death, himself dies. The official version is suicide. What are the links between all of these events, the years, and even the different times, countries, and continents? Only Sherlock Holmes knows, or those who can follow his deductive method. The disappearance of the IMF credit became the starting point of the investigation for journalist Oleg Lurie. 1998, a time when Russia was still needy and was given a huge line of credit by the IMF. The main negotiator for Russia with the IMF at that time was the Deputy Minister of Finance in charge of international credit obligations, Mikhail Kasyanov. That summer, in July 1998, the IMF, after a visit from a delegation headed by Mikhail Kasyanov, opens up a $4.7 billion line of credit. And guess what? The credit got to the Republic National Bank of New York, but never arrived in Russia. That credit disappeared, split into all manner of other accounts. And the owner of the Republic National Bank of New York in 1998 was Edmund Safra, a famous banker. In 1999, he saw what had been done that summer of 1998 and what kinds of account transactions had occurred. He panicked. The funds had vanished too obviously. They disappeared, never going to their goal, never going to Russia. And Mr. Safra became afraid and decided to give himself up, telling the FBI where the credit went. After which, the Kasyanov went to see him on the Côte d'Azur. That emissary was none other than the late Boris Abramovich Berezovsky. What they talked about, we cannot say. Their talk was rather long. After which, Safra panicked and even left the Côte d'Azur and fled to his estate in Monaco, which was under very tight security, guarded super windows, and totally impenetrable security. It even had a bunker for survival in case of nuclear war. So it seemed he had secured himself. But 3 months later, in a most improbable circumstance, Safra's estate and even its bunker were burned up together with Safra himself. In London, I met with Boris Berezovsky. We talked for a very long time. He loved to talk. I was very interested in the wild 1990s and what had happened in Russia then. He told me all kinds of things, including many things that were not common knowledge. Very interesting details. But when I asked him about the story of Safra the banker, he became totally tense and went into his shell. He didn't say a word. "I won't discuss that topic," he said. My name is Sergei Sokolov. I used to head the security service atoll for Boris Berezovsky. Boris, it must be said, was quite a complicated person. They call him an oligarch, but for me he was just Boris. We were together from the very beginning. My job was to protect him and never get into politics, and I did my job. And so, in time, we became much closer. In March 2013, we heard the sad news from London that Boris was no more. I tell you, I don't believe the story that he killed himself. I knew Boris far too well. You know, he was incredibly fond of life, and suicide and Berezovsky are two things that just don't go together. And the main thing is that Boris was planning to come back to Russia, and I knew about this. We have, I can say, an enormous quantity of documents confirming everything, including lists of secret intelligence agents of the CIA and MI6, which reported on certain events and certain plans to their leadership. We also have a document which proves that the whole story with the stolen IMF loan and the further work of the Hermitage Capital is none other than an assignment, a secret assignment. Operation Quake of the CIA, together with the US National Security Agency, and the agents who wrote this report prove it all. It's a big story. Why was it dangerous for Boris to go back to Russia? Boris was planning to come home, but not empty-handed. He really wanted to atone for his guilt and give Putin the most valuable asset he possessed at that time, information. But somebody wanted to prevent this from happening at any price. And so Boris was condemned to suicide. Of course, imitating suicide is a fairly standard method of professional killers. My task was not the investigation of how they did it. These are basically standard things. It's obvious that this was the work of a high-class professional killer, and professionals, as you know, leave no traces. I wanted to understand something else. I wanted to understand what this information was that Boris wanted to pass on to Putin. And the main thing, who ordered the hit on him? I carried out a mass of meetings with my colleagues from the leading secret services of the world, with businessmen, journalists, and British files. And I can tell you, from all kinds of different sources, I increasingly came across one name. The name of William Browder. To be honest, the figure of Browder himself was not very interesting to me until the story with Magnitsky. Because when I was investigating, I had certain contacts with the people who were in the investigative solitary confinement ward, together with Sergei Magnitsky. And I was imprisoned for 4 years during that time. And I myself had occasion to be in contact with Sergei Magnitsky during transfer moments, when he was being taken to court appearances. And basically, I observed him and had contact with those people who were there when he died in Matrosskaya Tishina prison. And generally, I came to the conclusion that nobody killed him and nobody beat him, although they say that he was beaten. He just got sick. Yes, it's Butyrka. It's Matrosskaya Tishina. That's how it was, and I confirm that that's how it was. But Magnitsky was really sick, and the medicine was, yes, negligent, awful prison medicine, prison camp medicine. In this case, jail medicine. That is, it used to be balancing on the edge of catastrophe, and now it's already evening itself out. Yeah, the man died. The man died. It's a tragedy. Why is Kasyanov so avidly lobbying for the Magnitsky list? He's working for the very same Browder now, working to make sure that everything that is now known about him remains a secret. After all, the Geneva prosecutor said many times, the Americans know everything, and they have all the documents about the disappearance of the loan from the IMF. But they don't want to process these documents, and they don't want to help us investigate. So how did this money get laundered further? Did the funds go on through Switzerland? Kasyanov was premier at the time, and now he's in the opposition. So they're keeping him on a very short leash. And basically, he is now operated by Mr. Browder. Captain Paul Beryl is one of the most powerful figures in the Society of Global Secret Agents. Among his espionage curriculum vitae highlights the creation of a counterintelligence service for President Mitterrand of France, and before that, service in one of the most elite special intelligence units in the world, the French Interference Group of the French Gendarmerie GIGN. One of the most famous operations carried out by Paul was the freeing of the Great Mosque of Mecca during a terrorist attack on November the 20th, 1979. Possibly one of the most complicated hostage-freeing operations in the history of the global elite unit operations. He's also in charge of running two of the most powerful private security services in the world, Epsilon and Secrets.
Avant tout, je suis un gendarme. Je suis né dans une gendarmerie
To begin with, I'm a policeman. I was born in the gendarmerie, and I'm a French officer. I was also one of the heads of the anti-terrorist task force of the French police for several decades. Then I began a personal security service in Qatar and several other Arab countries, and then in Africa, where I was a security advisor to the president of Rwanda. First of all, William Browder is an American who changes his nationality easily. He comes to England and trades his American passport for a British one. Then he made himself a fortune in Russia, and at Russia's expense, since what he did were financial machinations and corporate raider-style takeover of major companies whose assets he took out of Russia. But the main source of Browder's fortune is money gained from corruption, which he uses in his battle against Russia under the leadership of the Central Intelligence Agency, which does not want Russia to revive and be strong. We have at our disposal a complete list of financial transactions, together with information about how this money left Russia and arrived in untouchable offshore accounts. These accounts became William Browder's secret reserve. William Browder has concentrated enormous wealth in his hands. This money is all taken out of Russia. And it's pretty handy, taking your enemy's money and then using it against him. He manipulates lawyers whom he hires to file lawsuits against Russia with the goal of discrediting Russia. The goal of the American foreign policy is to dominate the world and control its energy resources, particularly oil and gas. Russia supplies gas in large volumes to Europe, and America's goal is to cut back Europe's importation of gas so as to lower the standard of living in Russia. That's why he set up projects aimed at destabilization, particularly in the Ukraine, and William Browder takes part in the designing of these attacks and the discreditation of Russia and President Putin. But you shouldn't forget that in France we have 1,250,000 French citizens who are of Russian descent. That's 1.25 million Russians in this country. That's why a part of France's heart will always beat for Russia. I'd sue William Browder in France. He has to be watched when he travels around the country. A lawyer should follow him and immediately serve him with process of the lawsuit. I think that that's the best way to legally and quickly neutralize him. I'm absolutely certain that William Browder, together with the agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, was behind the death of Safra. Plus, I have undeniable documentary proof that Browder is an agent of the CIA, where his code name is Solomon, and he was subsequently transferred to MI6. I don't consider Brits or Americans, ordinary Americans, to be our enemies. I have very many friends, even amongst the spies, British and Americans and Cubans. And they're all normal guys who are honestly doing their jobs. And yes, each of them has their own life, and yes, each of them has his own country. But can't people live on one floor in separate flats without quarreling and preserve normal human relationships without setting each other's doormats on fire and sticking gum in peepholes? Of course they can. So why can't we do it? Life gives us stories that are even more compelling than Conan Doyle's tales. And nonetheless, we compare the heroes of our time with the characters in his stories. But is the image of Moriarty in our case a bit of a stretch? After all, our character hardly seems like a villain. Not at all. Although Moriarty himself also seemed quite decent at first glance. Out of principles of openness and objectivity, Mr. Browder was contacted and offered a chance to comment on all that appears in this program. But so far, at least up until now, He has preferred to keep silent.